Howdy folks, welcome back to another Out of Spec Renew video. My name is Alex and I own an electric vehicle repair shop here in Portland, Oregon called Wattworks. I work on exclusively just electric vehicles, anything from the mainstream stuff like the Tesla models, Nissan Leaf, things like that, all the way down to the more obscure sort of compliance cars like the Fiat 500e and Toyota RAV4 EV and those kind of vehicles. Car that we're working on here today is a 2013 Model S. It started out life as a P85, but back in 2018 it actually had a 90 kilowatt hour pack swap, so now it's a P90. But we're not here for the battery pack today, we're here for the large drive unit, which is located in the rear of the car. The Tesla large drive unit is quite prone to a couple different issues, and this is suffering from two of them. So we're going to be pulling this drive unit out and rebuilding it, as well as sort of bulletproofing and future-proofing it so that it can hold up long-term for the customer and they can hopefully drive it for many years to come. So anyways, let's get into it. So what are the issues with the drive unit on this car, do you ask? Well, it has two of the common failure modes for the large drive unit, one of which is a milling noise coming from the bearings in, it kind of depends on really early motors. Sometimes it can be the rotor bearings. On later replacement motors, which I suspect this is, but I don't know for sure yet, it's usually the primary drive gear bearings in the gearbox. So anyway, we'll be looking at all that stuff when we get the drive unit out. The second thing that I was told by the customers is an issue, which I have yet to confirm, is that they noticed it had presence of coolant on the rotor encoder sensor, otherwise known as a speed sensor. And basically that tells you that well, let me kind of rephrase that. If there's coolant present on the rotor encoder sensor, that's indicative that the rotor coolant seal is leaking internally into the drive unit, which can cause a myriad of issues from loss of high voltage isolation within the windings. It can cause damage to the rotor bearings because the coolant literally ends up going through the bearing to get into the stator. And it can also damage the electronics in the inverter. So there's kind of a myriad of issues that coolant intrusion can cause. And if it's not caught early enough, it will absolutely destroy the drive unit. So it's imperative to catch those issues early and address them before they become even more expensive to fix. So we'll check the encoder sensor here in a minute, but first I want to take the car for just a quick little test drive around the block and demonstrate to you guys the milling noise that it's making from the bearings. Alrighty, we're in the car getting ready to pull on the street. As you may notice, our MCU is dark. It actually happened to the customer as they were bringing the car to the shop. So it's actually scheduled to have an MCU 2 upgrade with Tesla service. But we're just going to take it for a quick little cruise around the block and see if hopefully the mic will actually pick up the milling noise that it makes. It's pretty subtle in this car. It's not super loud. But it sort of picks up with speed a little bit. At first becomes just barely audible, maybe around 5 or 6 miles an hour. And up here, closer to 15, it's fairly audible. Alrighty, we've got the car all staged here on the lift, ready to go up. First things first, we need to disconnect the 12 volt battery and the high voltage interlock loop, which we can do from under the frunk here. So we're going to take off some plastic panels and disconnect that stuff. So before we get too extreme in taking the wheels off and actually getting things apart, I want to pull the rotor encoder sensor out of this thing and see what kind of coolant intrusion we actually have present. I'm not 100% certain off the top of my head if when the customer checked this, if they may have cleaned the sensor off, but I know that when they checked it, they did see some coolant present. So we'll see if there is still coolant present or if more coolant is present or whatever the case may be there. But we got to remove this bottom cover off of here. Alrighty, so taking a look under here, this drive unit is indeed a replacement drive unit, but not very recently. So this car was a November 2013 build, This drive unit is a November of 2014 build, and it's not remanufactured. It was a new drive unit when it was installed, but it probably was installed either in very late 2014 or very early 2015. And the way that we can tell that is on the serial number here, where it says T14J. 14 means 2014. J is the 10th letter of the alphabet, so November. And if it was a remanufactured drive unit, it would have an R at the end followed by a number. So R1 would be remanufactured 1 time, R2 would be remanufactured 2 times, etc. So this has had a drive unit replacement, but not any time in recent history. So that kind of makes me wonder how this ended up getting broken, because that is a bit puzzling, since it's unlikely that this subframe was removed, unless it was removed for some other alternative reason, like a broken mount maybe, or I suppose it's entirely possible that someone other than Tesla could have swapped this drive unit in as a used drive unit. But I don't really see any evidence of any kind of tampering or anything like that that would indicate that that's the case. But anyways, let's go ahead and check our encoder sensor, which is located right up there. So to check the encoder sensor, first we're going to unplug it. I find that the easiest way to do that is just with a flat blade screwdriver. Kind of stick it in there, wedge it under the clip on the connector. Of course, you want to be careful not to break the clip. But if we kind of wedge it under there and then wedge it up to the back side of the connector, we can kind of give it just a little tap to get it kind of pushed back, and then I can get my finger in here and try and push back on it. Sometimes they get dirt jammed up in them and it makes it a little bit harder to unplug. There we go. Now it's coming out. So we've got that unplugged. And then I'm just going to take a 10mm ratcheting wrench and stick it right there on that screw and loosen it out. And there you go, we've got it out. And you can see it does look a little bit wet for sure. So anyways, that thing is removed now. We'll go ahead and drop the car back down. I'll take the wheels and stuff off and prep to start removing the subframe on this thing. Both parking brake calipers are loosened off, so this one's also loose. I'm going to go ahead and pull off the nut on the bottom of the struts here. I can't actually take the bolts out until we unload the struts when we start taking the subframe out, but for now I'm just going to get the nuts loosened off on both sides. So there's that one, and same deal on this side. So now I'm going to go ahead and go back up with the car a little bit. We're going to disconnect all of the connectors on the subframe, disconnect the coolant hoses, and drain the gearbox oil out. We'll also disconnect and unbolt a couple of other things while we're under there. And then once we get to that point, we should be good to start removing the subframe from the car. Our next step here is going to be draining the coolant out of the motor. My preferred method for this is actually to clamp off the coolant lines on the car side. Okay, there's that. So now I'll go ahead and remove the hose clamp on here. Okay. And is this hose broken loose? Oh, it is. Okay. And this makes a mess because it just dumps right on the subframe here. So I want to try not to get coolant splashing in my face. And that one still has a slow drip, so let me tighten this clamp up a bit. There we go. And then just so I don't have to sit here and wait forever for this thing to drain, I actually have a cap that I'm just going to put right on this thing here. And then we can drain it properly once we get the drive unit actually out of the subframe. But this is just a little bit of a time savings because otherwise it'll take forever to drip out. Now I'll go ahead and disconnect the coolant line on the other side as well. All right, go ahead and drain our oil out of here. There is actually a fair amount of metal on this plug here. Don't know how well you guys can make that out, but it's definitely on there, but that's pretty normal. That's about what I would expect to see. This one, I've actually seen drive units that work just fine that have a lot more metal than that. So this one's actually not too terrible. So the last thing we need to do before we can start actually dropping the subframe is we need to remove the shear plates here that are on the front portion of the subframe. So they've got 2 clips in them, a couple of T25 fasteners, and then this 15 millimeter hex. And now we're basically ready to start actually dropping the subframe out of the car. So let me get things set up for that. We're ready to start removing the subframe from the car. So I've got my setup here on top of my big table. I would absolutely love to have a lift table, but for the time being, this is my setup. It's just a big table on wheels. I have a pallet here so that if I need to take the subframe off of the table to use it for something else, I can go ahead and do that with the forklift. And then I just have some blocking here to make sure that it's at the correct level. And this particular setup of blocks is just about perfect for keeping it level. So without further ado, let's go ahead and drop the car down until the subframe is resting on my blocking. All right, we're resting on all of our blocks, so we're pretty much level here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to unbolt the 4 bolts that actually hold the subframe in, and then we can go up slightly and disconnect the rest of the things that we can't currently remove until the subframe is actually partially out. All right, all 4 bolts on our subframe are removed, so we're good to go up slightly. I'm only going to go up maybe about 1 inch or 1.5 inches to start with. All right, both of our main brake calipers are removed, so we're going to go up just a couple more inches, and then I am going to remove the high voltage cables from the drive unit, and there's also a ground strap we need to take off. So we'll go ahead and go up just a little bit. That should be enough clearance for us. And now we'll go ahead and see about removing those high voltage cables and the ground strap. So we're going to go ahead and remove our high voltage cables here, as well as this ground strap that's over here on the end. First I'm going to try and see if I can pull the cables out, which they look like the plating on them is starting to come off a little bit, so they might be pretty heavily corroded. But we'll go ahead and see if I can wiggle them loose. Hopefully that's the case. So far that one's not budging though. Let's try this one. Yeah, I was afraid of this with the amount of corrosion I've seen on this car. I think these are pretty stuck in here. So let me see if I can grab some tools to try and get those things broken loose. I've got here is basically just a pry bar that I'm inserting from the bottom that I can hammer on from the bottom side here and hopefully get this gland to break loose. Boom. Oh, there goes the camera. Heck yeah, we got them both. It's interesting, the corrosion actually... Oh, you know what? The corrosion is mostly on the back side. I can feel it. Won't be able to see it until we actually get this out of here a bit more, but... Anyways, those things are off. We have everything disconnected now, so we should be able to bring the car up the rest of the way and get this whole thing out of here. Alrighty, heck yeah. Our drive unit is now removed from the car. Got a little bit of stuff on there. So now I'll go ahead and roll this thing out, and we'll start removing the bolts and stuff so that we can take the drive unit out of the subframe, and we'll get it onto our motor stand to start with the rebuild. So now we're ready to go ahead and start pulling the drive unit out of the subframe here. First things first, we need to pull the axle stubs out. So the easiest way that I find to do that is to disconnect the upper links on the outside edge. So that's going to be this bolt here, and then there's another bolt back here. That way we don't affect anything with the alignment. Obviously the inner bolt here is a cammed bolt that has the toe adjustment, but if we do the outer ones, that doesn't affect our alignment. So we're going to pull those out on both sides, and then we'll pop the axles out of the gearbox right there. Now that our upper links on both sides have been unbolted, now we can go ahead and remove the axles. The easiest way I find to do this is to take a big pry bar, and we'll rotate the axle to a spot where I have good purchase on it, and then I'm just going to give it a good bump. Let me lock my wheels in place on the table so it doesn't move here. So we'll just give that a good bump. Okay, hammer time. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to get it right there in position. We'll just give it a good shock right here on the side of the pry bar. There we go. Perfect. A little bit of persuasion. And we'll do the same thing. We'll just push our hub down out of the way and get the axle out of its hole in the gearbox. Now we can go ahead and unbolt at least this would be the frontmost motor mount bolt, and then there's one on the back side, and then we have a mount over here on this side as well. But I'm gonna go ahead and grab the forklift, and we'll get this thing supported before we start unbolting anything. Alrighty, let's go ahead and pick up this drive unit, and we'll get it on our stand here. Alright, so we'll go ahead and pull our crossover tube off of here. It's just got a couple of fasteners in it. And then that will pop right out of place. Just like so. So that we can get our clamp on here. And now we can go down the rest of the way. Okay, we're pretty much settled in there. Let me go ahead and reposition the camera so that you guys can actually see how this clamp works. Alright, so on this side of the clamp, we've basically just got these kind of eye bolts, I guess you could call them. And they'll just clamp down on here, and then our motor will be held captive in here. Now we're about ready to start taking this thing apart, but if you'll remember, we plugged off all of our coolant holes on here so that we weren't dripping coolant the whole time we were removing the motor. So I've got my catch bucket down there. We're going to go ahead and dump out all of the remaining coolant in the motor, which would be pretty easy on here because now I can rotate the motor around to dump all the coolant out. I'll remove the plug on this side so it no longer has an airlock. Scoot that over a smidge, and there we go. Now we can get basically all of the coolant out pretty effectively that way. So I'll just let that drain for a minute. Well, we don't even really have to wait for it to drain because now we can actually get started on removing the inverter right up there. So let's go ahead and do that now. All right, I can't really position the camera in a spot where you can see me pull these fasteners out, so let's just set you guys up over there, and we'll just pull all these fasteners out. Now it's time to actually pull the inverter off the motor. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab it on the sides here, and I'm just going to give it a little wiggle because it'll kind of have a little bit of a seal on the motor. There we go, I broke the seal loose. And then I'm just going to pick it straight up. I'm going to bring it over here to this wooden block setup that I have. I'm just going to set it down right there. And it's pretty sturdy on there, but obviously this is an irreplaceable part. Don't want it to fall over. I shouldn't say irreplaceable, but very hard to get. So I'm going to just take a wood screw in here and I'm going to run it in through one of the holes and just fasten it to our little jig here so that it's nice and secure. There we go. So now that's secure on there. It's not going anywhere. And there's our inverter off. Now we can go ahead and flip the motor over and we'll work on pulling the motor apart from the other side. We probably won't be able to pull the rotor out without first splitting the gearbox and punching it out through the other side, but we'll give it a shot. I'm going to go ahead and flip the motor over here. And I'm going to try to aim to have all of our coolant end up in our coolant collection bucket, which we slightly missed there, as per usual. That's all right. We'll be okay. And what I should have also done was I should have tied this up so it doesn't drag in the coolant there. We'll do the same for both of these harnesses. We don't want them catching on stuff. There we go. That'll be okay right there. Now we can go ahead and start pulling stuff apart here. That's interesting. There's some gray silicone here where the coolant nipple went in, which kind of makes me wonder if, I don't know, maybe someone tried to seal that up at some point. That's pretty bizarre. That's not normal for that to be there. Anyways, we'll go ahead and start by pulling off our rotor coolant manifold on here. Okay, I'm gonna move our coolant catch over here because we're probably gonna have a bunch of coolant come out of the rotor. Potentially, maybe not. There we go, and then we'll work it back the other way. And there we go. So now we're flipped back over again. And now we'll go ahead and pull the gearbox apart. Alrighty, we're all unbolted on our gearbox here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to tap the motor mounts on each side and we should be able to break that thing loose pretty easily. Boom. Oh, interesting. We actually pulled the bearing right off of the differential there. That's unusual. Usually that stays attached. All right, so we have the gearbox open. Our counter gear bearing here stayed on the counter gear, which is also odd. I have seen that pretty regularly though, but usually that differential bearing stays attached to the differential. But anyways, that's our gearbox open. I guess now that I think about it, I should have pulled the nuts out of the retainer plate on the differential. Seems like every time I pull one of these apart, I forget to do that before flipping the motor over. All right, we can go ahead and start removing gears here now. First though, well, the first gear that we're going to take off is this little plastic one that is for the oil pump drive. So it just has a little E-clip on here. So we'll just pull that little E-clip off. And then this gear should just pull right off of the shaft. Pretty simple. We're going to take our differential here, and that should just wiggle free pretty easily. There we go. So that thing's loose. I'm going to set that aside in my gear bin. And now we just have our counter and primary drive gears. These also have 10 millimeter, or at least the head on the bolts is 10 millimeter. They're an M6. But we have 3 per gear for the retainer plates. So I'm just going to loosen all those off. And I'm probably going to need a magnet to grab those out of there. Let me grab one real quick. All right, I got my magnet. There's one fastener. And then I'm going to rotate this. By the way, if you're dealing with a seized motor, it's quite difficult to rotate the gears to get all of the fasteners. In some cases, you can't even rotate them at all. In which case, the only solution is you have to get the rotor out first, which there's sort of a, I don't know, just a plug in the primary drive gear here that has a little tiny hole in it. Basically what you got to do is you just got to drill that thing out and then punch the rotor out before you can take the gears out. Kind of sucks to do it that way, but sometimes you got to do what you got to do. Anyway, that's all of our fasteners out. So we'll remove our retainer plates from these things, and then we'll set all those parts aside. Now we should be able to remove the counter gear. Now, if this were a RAV4 EV or a Mercedes B-Class, you'd have to remove the counter gear and the primary drive gear simultaneously. But on the Model S, it's pretty easy. You can just pull the counter gear out fairly simply. Sometimes they'll slip out nice and easy, like this one just did. Sometimes you have to stick a puller in there. But this one worked it out pretty nicely. Or at least it slid out most of the way. I might need to get something in here and just jiggle it a little bit to get it out the rest of the way. There we go. So there's the counter gear removed. And now the primary drive gear should hopefully just slide right out of there. In theory, anyways. Sometimes they put up a fight, though. Dang, yeah, that one is not wanting to move very easily. Oh, there we go. Just had to wiggle it a little bit. And we're stuck on our oil pump there. There we go. There's a little nozzle that sticks out, but you can kind of wedge past it. Anyway, that's our primary drive gear out. I'll go ahead and rotate this thing. And I want to get this out of the way because now we're going to lose all of our remaining oil in the gearbox, which I want to drain into my big pan. There we go. And then I should be able to grab a tool here and loosen our retainer off. Just like so. And now I can grab the rotor and just pull it straight out of here. Can't see that we do have some rust on here. It's interesting that the copper didn't really get any appreciable corrosion on it though. There we go, there's the rotor out. And I will set this down over here. So we have this whole thing blown apart now. If we take a look inside of our stator here, you can definitely see there's a fair amount of rust on the steel bars in the stator. So we're gonna have to clean all that stuff up. But it doesn't look too awful. But yeah, definitely good that we caught this at the time that we did, because this was a ticking time bomb with the amount of coolant getting in here. So that's the key. Catch them early so that they're repairable. And that's why we want to always check rotor encoder sensors on large drive unit equipped cars. I do it for free. If any car comes to my shop that has a large drive unit in it, I check the rotor encoder sensor for the customer. Or even if someone wants to just bring a car by that they're not even having any other work done, I'll still do that check for free, because it is imperative to check it to avoid total failure of these drive units. Otherwise it gets much more expensive to repair. But anyways, so we've got that going for us. The rotor I set over here. And we have a little bit of corrosion on the outside of the rotor. Not too bad. That's going to be easy to clean up. The other thing that I want to check is I want to check our stator isolation while it's divorced from the inverter, because the inverter has really pretty low isolation compared to what the stator should have. The stator should have very, very high isolation resistance. So I'm going to go ahead and check that real quick with our mega ohmmeter. All right, so I've got the mega ohmmeter here. We'll set it to 500 volts. We'll go ahead and hook our negative lead up to just anywhere on the case that's grounded. And then I'll go ahead and put the positive lead on one of the phases. All the phases are technically interconnected, so you're going to get the same value no matter which phase you check. But we'll go ahead and check all three just to be sure. And then we'll just press and hold our test button there. Uh-oh, I slipped off. So we'll let that drop down in voltage again before I hit test again. There we go. All right, now we'll press test. Oh yeah, we're jumping up pretty quick. It's a little bit lower than what I would typically like to see on a large drive unit, but this one is well within what I would consider to be serviceable range. Yeah, we're 30 mega ohms and climbing. If it were a really healthy, like a super healthy stator, it'd be 100 plus mega ohms. Whoops. But 30 is pretty respectable. That's serviceable. When we clean up the stator, we'll probably clean it out with some isopropyl alcohol, probably try and heat it up and bake it a little bit and see if we can get that isolation number to improve. But that is definitely pretty decent. Yeah, and you can see we're going to get basically the same result no matter which one of the phases we check, because again, they are basically all interconnected with each other. So it's going to be basically the same value. As a matter of fact, if I took a multimeter and checked between two phases together, you'd get basically 0 ohms, because they are all interconnected through the windings. All right, so to clean out the stator, what I'm going to do is I have just sort of an abrasive wheel here on a drill. And this is actually just a fiberglass abrasive wheel. You can kind of think of it like a wire brush, except instead it's a fiberglass brush. So this is soft enough that it shouldn't really cause much of any damage to the actual resin in here, but we should be able to remove that scaly rust in there. But before I hit the inside of the stator with that, I'm going to take some just blue shop towels and I'm going to shove them back here just into the back of the stator cavity so that we don't end up with a bunch of rust dust collecting in here, because it's very difficult to clean out from the back of the stator where the windings kind of curve down inside and then you just have the empty cavity behind it. So we want to minimize any kind of conductive dust that gets collected in here, so that's what those towels are for. I might have to grab a couple more for that. There we go, so that cavity's all pretty much filled up there. Now I'll go ahead and take the drill and I'm just going to run it around the inside of here to try and clean up as much of that rust as possible. So inside of the stator is all cleaned out, got most of the corrosion out of there. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a very liberal amount of just isopropyl alcohol. If this were a stator where the isolation was in really, really poor shape, I would probably basically bathe the thing in isopropyl alcohol. In this case, we're not to that point, but what I am going to do is I'm going to wipe it down pretty heavily. So I'm just going to take a nicely soaked towel with the stuff, and we're going to wipe this whole thing down inside with IPA. And then I'm gonna kind of let that evaporate a little bit, and then I'll come back again and I'll do that a couple more times. And then we'll try and heat this thing up and sort of bake it a little bit, see if we can get that isolation number to improve. So while we've got the stator over here cooking, we're going to go ahead and replace our high voltage cables. So I've got a brand new set of cables here straight from Tesla, and the high voltage junction box where they connect to is underneath the rear seat here. So we're going to take apart the rear seat, get the old cables out, swap those ones into their place. And that way, when the drive unit is all finished with the rebuild, we can go ahead and stick it right in here. So as we can see here, this car is obviously equipped with dual onboard chargers, which I actually didn't realize. But the one over on the right side there, that's the primary charger. And then this one over here is the secondary charger. So that one basically controls everything, and this one is just controlled by the primary one. On cars that just have a single onboard charger, obviously they would just have the one there, and then this area would just be empty. But yeah, this is actually not a super common option on the Model S. And basically it just enables the car to be able to charge at 80 amps on level 2 charging, 240 volts. So this was pretty ahead of its time. There were no other cars that could charge at that sort of charge rate when the Model S was released. There's some new options on the market that can charge at 80 amps now, like the F-150 Lightning, the Chevy Silverado, and there's probably a few other cars too that can charge at 80 amps. But Model S was definitely the first EV that could charge at those sort of levels. Anyways, what we need to do now is we have to be able to get this sort of cage structure out so that we can actually access our high voltage junction box. Actually, I take that back. We might be able to remove the lid on the junction box without removing the cage structure, which is kind of a nice thing on cars that have the Gen 1 junction box, is I think we might be able to remove it without taking the rest of the seats apart, because otherwise we have to take the actual back pieces off. If I remember right, though, we might be able to get that lid off of there without removing the rest of this structure. Alright, so here's our high voltage cables. I'm basically just going to take this grommet and sort of squish it a little bit on the top side here to get it started. And then it basically just pushes right through the hole there, so that's loose now. I think there's still a couple of attachment points on the underside of the car where those cables are attached, so I'll get those out, and then I'll just pull the cables out the rest of the way, and then we can insert the new ones. Alright, so here's our high voltage cables. I've got the car up in the air here, and we just have these little attachment points here where they're just kind of clipped on to these threaded studs that stick out of the body. It's actually very Mercedes style on that stuff, which these cars do actually use a lot of Mercedes parts, believe it or not. At least the older ones do. Newer ones, not so much. There we go. There's both of those off, and of course we already pushed our grommet out, so we can just pull the cable through. And there's the old cables out, so now I'll grab the new ones. Alright, so I've got our brand new cables. We'll go ahead and just push those through the same exact way that they came out. And then this grommet, I'm going to try and get it pushed into place. Alright, back seat is all back together on the Model S here. I also took the stator off of the heat. It's still pretty warm. I'm going to let it cool down before we mess with it again. But yeah, in total that thing sat on there for several hours. And now what I'm going to do is I am going to start working on swapping bearings. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to swap out this bearing on the primary drive gear. So let me get that set up in the vise. Alright, so I've got the primary drive gear set up here in the vise. I haven't really tightened it yet, but we'll get that nice and snugged up. And obviously I want to avoid damaging the teeth on the gear at all costs, but I have it put down as flush as possible on the vise so that we don't get any twisting. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove this nut that's a retainer for the gear here, and these can often be pretty difficult to get off because it's Loctited on there. So I might have to get some additional leverage on it. But let's see if we can get it just with the wrench here. Oh, actually we can. That came off surprisingly easy. Much easier than I would have expected. So I've got the primary drive gear set up over here on my press. And what we're going to do is we're going to take our brand new primary drive gear bearing, or at least one of them. I've kind of pre-lubricated this with some fresh Dexron 6 ATF, which is the fluid that these gearboxes use. And we're just going to press this thing on here. So I've got that started there. Get our little spacer. All right, and now I can start just pressing this into place. Shouldn't take a ton of force because this is not a super tight fit on this shaft. There we go. Fully installed. And there we go. There's our bearing on there. If I didn't mention it before, this is a hybrid ceramic bearing, which basically means that it uses ceramic balls in a metal race. And that has the advantage of A, they're really strong, and B, they're non-conductive, which the conductivity is what often leads to the noise issues with these. And the rotor bearings from the factory, at least on any of the drive units past about mid-2014, use hybrid ceramics for the rotor, but the gearbox always has just regular steel bearings. I've gotten into the habit within the last year of just defaulting to always replacing the primary drive gear bearings with hybrid ceramics as well, because it kind of extends the lifespan of the bearings and prevents them from having noise issues down the road. So anyway, that one's done. All we have to do is get the collar nut back on here. So I'll go ahead and stick this back in the vise, and we'll stick that nut on with some fresh thread locker. All right, so we're back on the large drive unit here. I didn't have enough time to get this finished up before the Thanksgiving holiday, so I'm back again after Thanksgiving. So it's been a few days since I've been on this thing. But what we're going to do next here is we're going to clean up the rotor, and then we'll go ahead and swap out the rotor bearings. And then after that, we can start actually putting the drive unit back together again. So first things first, I'm going to spin this up. And what I have here is I just have a drill with a big socket and a piece of heater hose stuck in the end, and I can actually stick it in the hollow end of the rotor here and spin it up with the drill, with the rotor just sitting kind of on these sort of makeshift V blocks I have here. And then what I'll do is once I get it spun up to speed, I'll quickly swap out to our fiberglass abrasive wheel there, and we'll just clean off all this corrosion that's built up on here. So should go pretty quick. Here we go. All right, so the rotor's all cleaned up here. We still have just a little bit of surface pitting and stuff in here from the rust. Not much that can be done about that. It is what it is. But the main thing is that we have no more corrosion present on here. I also cleaned up the end here where the sealing surface would normally be. Obviously, we're not putting a seal back in here again, which is a good thing because this sealing surface is quite heavily worn and pitted. So a seal would not be able to hold up on there without the end of this rotor being reworked. But now that we have this all done, we should be able to go ahead and install some new bearings on here, and then we can start putting the drive unit the rest of the way back together. Alright, first bearing's installed. We'll go ahead and do the second one. By the way, pro tip, I started on the splined end on purpose because it ends up being almost perfectly set up to get this one started now. Alright, now our rotor is ready to go. So now that our new bearings are installed for the primary drive gear, both on the gear itself and in the other case half, and then our new bearings on the rotor, we're ready to go ahead and start putting things together here. All that I really need to do here before that to happen is I just have to clean up the sealing surfaces here. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the O-rings from all of their spots in here carefully, so that they can be reused if possible. I do have extras, but limited quantities of them. And then I'm just going to take a flat-edged scraper razor blade, and I'm just going to scrape off all of the gasket material on the sealing surfaces here, all the way around the whole periphery of the gearbox here, and then we'll go ahead and start assembly. Alright, sealing surface is all cleaned off on the face of the motor here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to get ready to install the rotor. I'm going to first put some fresh high temperature grease in the splines here though. So I'm just going to reach in here and kind of put a decent glob of high temp grease on the inside of the splines for the primary drive gear. Then I'm going to do the same thing on the outside of the rotor over here as well. And there you can see freshly greased splines. I'm just going to kind of set it right on the edge here. And then I'm just going to let it slide in there. And sometimes you might have to try a couple times pulling it out and pushing it in, but it should just slide right into the splines. And when it's all the way in, I don't know, what do we have here? Maybe about 3/4 or maybe an inch gap between the face of the rotor and the edge of the windings here. So that's how we know it's fully in there. Now I'll go ahead and tip this up all the way vertical. And then I can go ahead and get the end cap, and I'll go ahead and get that installed on here as well. In order to do that, I'm basically going to just take some of the bolts here for the top, and then I'm going to try and sequence them down to get the lid fully into place. Again, we don't want to tweak the bearings, but we do want to suck the cover all the way down into position. So for this, I'm going to take this tool, and then I'm just going to go down sort of crisscrossing back and forth, just a little bit at a time. So I'm going to wait until the bolt contacts there, then I'm going to go across here, kind of do the same thing, and then I'm just going to kind of keep going around until we start getting our gasket maker squishing out. Make sure we're looking pretty even. We're pretty high on this side. So I'm going to go there. And I'll come back over here. And I think we're getting to the point where we're just about fully seated. Yep. Okay. And once again, these are all going to get torqued down. Make sure they're all tight. And then I believe that's the one we started with. Yes, it is. All right. Now, before it gets forgotten, I want to go ahead and get the encoder wheel pressed onto the end of the rotor there, although it's a little bit crusty looking, so let me clean that up first. All right, with the motor flipped over, we're going to do the exact same thing with this seal. Pop the old one out, and we'll stick a new one in. Here we go. Nice and flush all the way around. Sweet. And now we can get ready to install the inverter. Now, I have seen in these inverters leak around these O-rings before, so I have a habit of adding just a small bead of our gasket maker around there to potentially prevent leaks. It's pretty uncommon, but it's one of those things where I've seen it enough times that it's a problem that I like to mitigate. So I'm not going to go too extreme, just a real thin layer around the outside of the O-ring here. There's that. Make sure we don't have any moisture or anything in here. Looks like we're good. I'm going to go ahead and unbolt the inverter off of the wooden block over there from earlier, and we'll go ahead and get that thing set on here. All right, so I've checked the bottom of the inverter to ensure it's clean and dry, and it is good to go. What I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of set it in here at an angle, get the phases lined up, and then I'm going to sort of tilt it up into position and set it straight down. Make sure it looks like it's seated flat in there, which it is. And my phase temperature wiring here is a little bit wonky, but I think I can get it into position with just a little nudge. There we go, perfect. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and get the hardware in the top side and get this bolted down. Just like before when I took this thing apart, it's a little bit hard to film all that just because it's such a tight space, so I probably won't really be able to show it. But we're installing all of the hardware that goes on the inside of the inverter there. So there's a total of 15 bolts. So there's the 4 around the rectangle on each of the phase drivers, and then there's those 3 in the center. So I'll go ahead and get all those put in. And once we get the motor off the stand, we can get that crossover tube on that goes between here and here. Obviously, with the clamp in the way, the tube can't be installed. But the other thing that I want to do before we get the motor off of the stand is I want to go ahead and put oil in the gearbox. It's just a little bit easier to do it here at this level rather than trying to refill the gearbox when it's in the subframe. I find that the easiest way to do this is basically just to fill it straight through the axle hole here. So I'm going to go ahead and get some fluid measured out for the gearbox, and then we'll go ahead and fill it up. Alright, at this point the drive unit is all fully installed in the subframe. We've got both axles in. All of our suspension links are tightened back up. I put some new zip ties here. Those are where the high voltage cables get zip tied onto the subframe. All that's left to do is get this thing in the car, and once we do that, there's a few orders of process. So it's basically just going to be the reverse order of what happened when we removed the subframe. Before the car gets fully seated with the subframe, when we're maybe, I don't know, about 2 or 3 inches out, we're going to go ahead and get the struts bolted into the knuckles right there. We're going to get the high voltage cables inserted, at least inserted into the inverter and started. We're going to attach our ground cable here. Once all that stuff is set up, then we'll go ahead, and of course we'll zip tie the cables too. And then once all that stuff is set up, then we'll lower the car down the rest of the way so that we're sitting, basically right on the subframe almost. Get all the bolts lined up, and then bolt the subframe in place. And then it's just buttoning up the last things, right? Putting on the brake calipers, reattaching the low voltage harnesses here. And that's pretty much it. Redoing the parking brake servos. But that's pretty much it. We're in the home stretch here, so this thing is getting close to being ready to run. Alrighty, it's the next morning here. I've got a path cleared to get this car out, so let's go ahead and take it for a little test drive. Alrighty, we're in the car here. DPMS is still unhappy. I'm going to go ahead and take it out of jack mode, at least once the car boots up. I also did plug the car in last night and let it charge up a bit, because it was pretty low. Come on. There we go. Out of jack mode. I'll go ahead and reverse this out of the shop, and I'll join you as we go out onto the street. Alrighty, here we go onto the street. Very nice. Motor seems like it's pretty quiet, maybe just a touch of noise, but that kind of is what it is when the motors are this kind of age. It's pretty unlikely that they'll ever be totally silent when it's one that's this age with any kind of decent amount of mileage on them. But it does seem like it's quieter than before, for sure, which is definitely good. Everything seems good. I'm going to take it for a little higher speed run down the street here, and I'll come back to you as we're coming back into the shop. Alrighty, well that's going to do it for this one. Successful drive unit rebuild. This one turned out pretty good. Pretty quiet for the most part, tiny bit of noise, but that kind of is what it is when you're dealing with a 10-year-old drive unit being rebuilt. So yeah, that's pretty much going to do it for this video. If you have any questions about this process or anything, feel free to leave a comment. And if you like seeing this kind of repair content, stay tuned for more stuff coming your way.